Hello and welcome to Prince Eye on China column. I am Sana Hashmi. I'm a fellow with the Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation. So this week I focused on Chinese reaction to India's internal politics, the divide over its relationship with Beijing, how China is being discussed within the two main political parties in India. And the trigger was the comment by Sam Pitroda, who's the head of the Indian Overseas Department in the Indian National Congress. So, of course, India's relationship has been complicated, specifically since 2020, since the Galwan clashes. We could call it strained, strategic, and sometimes even contradictory. But here's the twist. China isn't just watching Indian policies towards China, towards the US, and in the Indo Pacific, it's also watching our politics too. And in fact, this is a very natural phenomena when it comes to countries as huge as China and India. Of course, in India, we do not really have this privilege to look at Chinese domestic politics as it is so opaque. The latest buzz has been, as I mentioned, Indian National Congress, Sam Pitroda's comment on China. So Pitroda's suggestion to the Indian government that India shouldn't really treat China as an enemy, it kind of set off a political storm back home. We saw how the BJP official leaders and supporters responded to it. They lashed out, of course, and for obvious reasons. And then I do believe that there needs to be some level of unity with respect to China. There needs to be a collective response to how to deal with China. This is an important issue, and there is this consensus that China has been our primary security threat. But despite, of course, the comment from BJP we have seen, but then it's kind of surprising that how the comments were picked up in China as well. How it actually became one of the important topics in the Chinese discourse, how the strategic community talked about it, as well as Chinese media. So much of the discourse, and in fact there was several commentators who actually called Petroda's comment as heartfelt, and also at the same time they called BJP spokesperson Sudhanshu Trivedi's response as they actually likened it to the into an enraged lion. So if you look at the contrast, they're actually seeing Congress more favorable towards China, and it's BJP that is kind of angry towards China. So some Chinese analysts even called Petroda's comment rational. And they actually saw it as a sign that India might be able to rethink its China policy, as there are diverse voices on China, as there are voices that are calling for more engagement with China and to see China as a friend. But the question here is, does this really reflect a deeper shift? Or is it just wishful thinking in Beijing, especially among the strategic community as well as media? So many of the Chinese experts that I looked into, they believe that Congress is more open to engagement with Beijing, and specifically how the policy towards China, how India-China relations were during the UPA Congress, UPA rule, and also, so this is something that there is a common perception that perhaps Congress would have been more favorable than BJP towards China. And then at the same time, the belief is there that BJP has taken a tougher stance towards China. So definitely, the kind of China, the discourse is absolutely more favorable towards Congress. They are more into this idea that perhaps relationship with China would have been much better had Congress been there in power. And they're also reading between the lines that are pointing out contradictions even within the Modi government itself. They definitely look at what the Indian ministers, what the Indian leaders have been saying about China. So one example that I was intrigued, that how they mentioned that India's finance minister wants to ease Chinese investment. They want to have more Chinese, the Ministry of Finance, they want to have more investment. And I think they were perhaps referring to the last year's recommendation about Chinese investment. And then at the same time, how Minister of Commerce calls for restriction on Chinese investment as well as on less goods from China. And of course, we have a huge trade deficit with China. And then I also looked at some of the articles that talked about, specifically after Modi's visit to the US, how they talked about Trump calling India a trade aggressor, and then how there is a huge trade deficit from the US side to India. And I think that there is this hypocrisy that this is the same thing that India has been facing with respect to China. And there's no mention of that. So double standards, hypocrisy is definitely there. Perhaps this is just about shaping the narrative that how there are cracks in the wall in India US relationship, and how India has to look towards China now. The relationship between, given the relationship between the US and India are not going to be same as it was before, as perhaps it was during Trump 1.1. This is also one of the main points of discussion with respect to India, with respect to the US India relationship. Um, so the question that is kind of prevalent in Chinese discourse is that, is this a fractured policy, this division of views on China, or even among Modi government, or within among different political parties, or this is just politics as usual, or China is becoming an important topic for vote bank. So this is also being asked on Chinese media and social media. Then apart from that, of course, I've already mentioned about the US angle, how US, of course, everything has been looked in China through the US China angle. So there are a number of analysts and commentators in China who argue that India relies on Washington to counter Beijing. But with the potential policies, differences in policies of Trump, could things change? If the US dial down on its Indo Pacific strategy, if the perception towards China changes, China thinks that the many strategic analysts and commentators, even media, they have been saying that India might be left with fewer options vis-a-vis Indo-Pacific, vis-a-vis Quad, vis-a-vis how they want to approach China. And some in Beijing even predicted that India could warm up to China, not out of goodwill, but perhaps to regain its influence in this equation and with the US. And then it might happen, we have seen before as well, but then I think this is something that's kind of misplaced. There is a flawed interpretation of how India sees the US and its relationship with the US. India is not cooperating with the US primarily to counter China, and this is something that the Chinese has unable to understand. And this is something that I have been reading about, that India will reach out, India will warm up to China because there are differences, there are bilateral irritants in India US relationship. And perhaps this is something that they haven't been able to understand, that India deals with its bilateral issues, bilateral relationship at the bilateral level. China is a threat for a number of countries, and trying to establish a collective response to address Chinese coercion and intimidation is something that not just India but other countries are looking at. But it doesn't mean that India is just looking at the US to deal with or to fight the Chinese. So, despite tensions, a few Chinese have been optimistic about India China relation, and this is definitely a minority view that's not condescending, that's not patronizing. It's a minority view, and yet it is optimistic that they definitely see a room for diplomacy, even despite tensions, even despite clashes, or even despite how India is still considered China a security threat, even also as economic security threat. So they believe that high level talks signal uh, a cautious progress, uh, detente in the relationship. And the high level meeting was, of course, the meeting between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping. But then here's the catch: China still expects India to look beyond the border dispute, and it wants to prioritize other aspects of the relationship, primarily economic cooperation, perhaps so that the dependency that India has on China continues to be there, and perhaps China could use it as further economic coercion tool, or could still weaponize the huge trade deficit or the investment. So I think this is something that Chinese has been saying, and no matter what, they are not really trying to understand what India's genuine concerns are. And I think this is just wishful thinking, because the reality is that India's concerns with China aren't just about the US influence, aren't just about India becoming a major power or replacing China within the regional context. I think it's more about trust, and the trust was kind of bridged after the 2020 Galwan clashes. India's outlook was entirely shifted vis-a-vis the line of actual control. So the idea that there is something that the Chinese side has not really paid attention to, and that India is being played by the US to counter China is, I do believe that it's absolutely a misplaced assertion. India has its own agency, India has its own interest why it is reaching out to the US for further advancement in the relation. It's entirely not about China. And even if it's about China, India's interests are very much at play there. So this tells us that China is not considering India's genuine interest and concern, and still, after all this while, they still see India as a pawn in this great power rivalry. They're not looking at India as a major power, as a decisive player, which it already is. So I think there is this denial that India is still inferior and India cannot play a role of a major power. India could not play a role of a decisive player. This is very much still existing within the Chinese psyche. Not just within the strategic community, but I do feel that this still exists within the psyche of the Chinese leadership. And I have written this before that China and much of the strategic community does not understand India very well. I think the narrative about India is very outdated, it's traditional, and they're not really able to make peace with India's rising status and still believe that India does not have its own agency. India is doing whatever the US wants us to do. And they are still unable to make peace with the idea of India standing up to protect its own territorial sovereignty and integrity and willing to keep other aspects at bay to secure its border. That partly explains why China foolishly turned a friend into a foe in 2020. And then it also never expected India to respond in a way that it did after the Doklam standoff and after the Galwan clashes. So, to be honest, even after 5 years, I do not really see much change in China's outlook towards India. I think the narrative has been very much the same since 2020. And in fact, if you ask me about then whatever is Chinese ambassador to India and the spokesperson is writing on Twitter and trying to reach out to the Indian uh, people is something that's very different that I see on the Chinese media platform. I think the narrative, the commentary is very much condescending. It's all about how India is still very inferior than China. India can't catch up to China. As in, I do see there's a lot of gap differences in what the English um, discourse is about India right now, or what the discourse in Chinese Mandarin is. It's totally different. So I think to progress, the Chinese side must understand that India's policies are independent of who is in power in the White House. And India's problem with China are due to the differences in the bilateral relationship and not because of the US. It's not driven by the US, and it's driven totally by Chinese actions. So India's shifting, I would say, shifted outlook and policies are a reaction to Chinese actions. And I think this is something that they haven't acknowledged and accepted in public discourse. And of course, we won't really get a public acceptance of this, that how the relationship are not as same as how it was 10 years ago, primarily because of the repeated incursions, repeated standoffs, and uh, the Chinese intention of keeping the border dispute alive to keep India preoccupied with it, to pressurize India whenever it wants to do. So I believe China can capitalize on Petroda's remarks if it wants, and I think that's the intention as well. But China must also understand that this is the power and essence of democracy, and it means that India could have and should have diverse view, and this is what exactly is at play in India right now. However, the real question isn't whether India sees China as a friend or foe. It's whether Chinese actions make friendship even possible. Because at the end of the day, real partnerships aren't built on coercion, conflict, or convenient interpretations of political debates in India. If China wants India to bridge a trust gap and be a so called friend, China should actually work towards it. And the progress in India China relations and the positive momentum depends only and only on China and its action. But to move towards that, what China has to accept that India cannot remain friend with China while China infringes on India's territorial integrity and sovereignty. And I think this is a realization that even before we get into this debate of how India sees China, whether it's a friend or an enemy, I think this is something the Chinese side has to accept, both the government as well as the strategic community. That is all for today for the Prince Eye on China column, and I'll see you next week. Thank you.